Imagine a man of God holding a rifle, not for hunting, not to protect his own life, but to defend 27 orphan children who looked at him as the last barrier between their innocent lives and a violent death. This man was Father Emil Kapaun, an American Army chaplain who on a freezing night in 1950 had to make a choice that no church manual or military handbook had prepared him for. The question that echoed that night in the frozen mountains of Korea wasn't about theology or military doctrine. It was simple and brutal. When evil knocks on your door carrying bayonets and a thirst for blood, do you pray or do you shoot? What happened that night defies everything you think you know about men of faith in times of war, and by the end of this video, you'll discover why this story was buried for decades in military archives. Far from the history books you read in school, the Korean War is often called the forgotten conflict, a shadow between the glory of World War II and the trauma of Vietnam. But for those who fought in the frozen mountains of the Korean Peninsula between 1950 and 1953, there was nothing forgettable about that white hell. Father Emil Kapaun wasn't an ordinary soldier. Born in Kansas in 1916, the son of Czech farmers, he grew up with dirt under his nails and the Catholic catechism in his heart. By the time he was ordained in 1940, the world was already burning. He could have stayed safe in a quiet parish, baptizing babies and delivering Sunday sermons. But when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, Emil felt a different calling. Young men from his community were shipping out to fight, and he believed they needed God on the battlefield more than anywhere else. So he joined the army as a chaplain, trading his simple cassock for military fatigues, though he never imagined he'd trade his crucifix for something far heavier. Father Kapaun served in the Burma theater during World War II, where he earned a reputation as the chaplain who went where angels feared to tread. While other clergymen stayed behind the lines offering prayers and last rites, Kapaun crawled into foxholes under enemy fire, dragged wounded men to safety, and shared his rations with soldiers who had none. He returned home in 1946 with a Bronze Star and a belief that his war days were over. He spent 4 peaceful years in Kansas, returning to the rhythms of parish life. But peace is often just the intermission between tragedies. When North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel in June of 1950, President Truman committed American troops to defend South Korea. Once again, Father Kapaun volunteered. He was 34 years old, and he told his bishop that soldiers needed spiritual guidance in the valley of death. What he didn't know was that this war would test his faith in ways Burma never had, and that an orphanage in a village called Unsan would become the stage for the most controversial decision of his life. By October of 1950, American forces were pushing deep into North Korea, chasing the retreating communist army toward the Chinese border. Victory seemed close. Soldiers joked about being home for Christmas. Father Kapaun was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, ministering to men who were exhausted but hopeful. Then, on a cold October night, everything changed. Chinese forces, hundreds of thousands of them, had secretly crossed the Yalu River and were now encircling American positions. The trap was set, and the 8th Cavalry walked right into it. In the chaos of retreat, Father Kapaun and a small group of soldiers found themselves cut off near the village of Unsan, where a Catholic orphanage housed 27 children, ages 3 to 14, and 2 elderly Korean nuns. The nuns begged for help. Chinese soldiers were advancing, and they had a reputation for showing no mercy to anyone associated with the West or Christianity. The children were terrified, and the soldiers wanted to keep moving to escape while they still could. Father Kapaun made a decision that shattered every expectation of what a chaplain should do. He told his men to take defensive positions around the orphanage. Then, against all his training and every vow he had taken, he picked up a rifle from a fallen soldier. His hands, which had only ever held a Bible and a communion chalice in combat, now gripped cold steel. The soldiers stared at him in disbelief. One sergeant reportedly asked him if he knew what he was doing, if he understood that a chaplain bearing arms violated the Geneva Conventions and could get him executed if captured. Kapaun's response was devastating in its simplicity. He said he knew exactly what he was doing, and that if protecting innocent children meant damning his soul, then that was a price he was willing to pay. For the next 6 hours, as Chinese forces probed the orphanage perimeter, Father Emil Kapaun became something the world had rarely seen. A warrior priest, holding the line between darkness and 27 beating hearts. What happened in those 6 hours, and the price Father Kapaun paid for his choice, reveals a side of war that historians rarely discuss, and that the military didn't want publicized. This is the story they buried, and now you're about to uncover it. To understand why Father Kapaun's decision was so radical, you need to understand what a military chaplain actually is in the eyes of the law and the church. Chaplains are non-combatants, protected under the Geneva Conventions precisely because they carry no weapons. They wear uniforms, they march with soldiers, they share the same dangers, but their role is spiritual, not martial. A chaplain who picks up a rifle doesn't just break military protocol. He fundamentally transforms his identity from protected clergy to legitimate military target. More than that, for a Catholic priest, the act of taking a life, even in defense of others, enters murky theological territory that has troubled the Church for centuries. The doctrine of just war allows for defensive violence, but priests are meant to be exempt from that calculation, their hands kept clean so they can administer sacraments without the stain of blood. Father Kapaun knew all of this. He had spent years studying theology, years understanding the sacred boundaries of his vocation, and on that October night in Unsan, he chose to cross every single one of those boundaries. The orphanage itself was a modest structure, a 2-story building with thin walls and a small chapel attached. It had been established by French missionaries decades earlier, before Korea was divided, before war became the permanent condition of the peninsula. The 27 children inside ranged from toddlers who barely understood what war meant to teenagers who understood it all too well. Many had watched their parents die in previous attacks. Some had walked for days to reach the orphanage, their feet bloody and their stomachs empty. The 2 nuns, Sister Marie and Sister Therese, were both in their 70s, too old to run, too faithful to abandon their charges. When Father Kapaun and his soldiers arrived, the children were huddled in the chapel, silent and terrified. Outside, the sounds of war were getting closer, distant gunfire, the rumble of artillery, the occasional scream that cut through the night air. The Chinese advance was relentless and methodical, sweeping through villages and eliminating resistance. Father Kapaun's soldiers numbered only 12 men, all that remained of a platoon that had been separated from the main force during the chaotic retreat. They were low on ammunition, exhausted from days of fighting and terrified of being captured. The Chinese army had a brutal reputation for dealing with prisoners, and stories of torture and execution were already spreading through American ranks. Several soldiers argued they should leave immediately, that staying to defend the orphanage was suicide, that their duty was to survive and rejoin their unit. They weren't wrong from a tactical standpoint. 12 men with limited ammunition couldn't hold off a Chinese assault for long. But Father Kapaun saw something in those children's eyes that made tactical thinking irrelevant. He saw absolute terror mixed with a desperate hope that the Americans, these tall foreigners with their powerful weapons, might be their salvation. The rifle Father Kapaun picked up was an M1 Garand, the standard infantry weapon of the American military. It weighed 9.5 pounds and held 8 rounds in its internal magazine. He had never fired one in combat, though he had basic training like all military personnel. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the chamber, as he felt the weight of this instrument of death. One of the soldiers, a corporal from Tennessee, showed him how to properly shoulder the weapon, how to aim down the sights, how to control the recoil. The lesson lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then they heard the first sounds of the enemy approaching, boots crunching on frozen ground, the metallic click of weapons being readied, voices speaking in Mandarin giving orders in the darkness. Father Kapaun took his position at a window on the 2nd floor, where he had a clear view of the eastern approach to the orphanage. Below him in the chapel, the children prayed in Korean, their small voices reciting the rosary that Sister Marie led in a steady, calming tone. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable, innocent prayers rising from below while above, a priest prepared to kill. This was his Gethsemane moment, his crisis of faith made manifest. And unlike Christ, who told Peter to put away his sword, Father Kapaun gripped his tighter. The first wave of Chinese soldiers appeared at approximately 2200 hours, moving in small groups through the scattered buildings at the edge of Unsan. They were part of the People's Volunteer Army, the force that China officially claimed was made up of volunteers rather than regular military, a fiction that fooled no one. These men were well trained, battle-hardened from years of civil war, and they moved with the confidence of an army that vastly outnumbered its enemy. American intelligence had catastrophically underestimated their presence in North Korea. What the 8th Cavalry thought would be a pursuit of defeated North Koreans had instead become a massive ambush by over 300,000 Chinese troops. The soldiers approaching the orphanage were scouts, probing for resistance, looking for easy targets. They expected to find frightened civilians, maybe a few stragglers from the retreating American forces. What they didn't expect was organized defensive fire from a stone building that should have been undefended. Father Kapaun watched through the window as shadows moved between the buildings. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he found himself praying not for guidance or forgiveness, but for steady hands. The corporal from Tennessee was positioned at the window next to him, and he whispered instructions. Wait for them to get closer. Aim for center mass, squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. And most importantly, make every shot count because ammunition was running out fast. The other soldiers were spread throughout the building, covering different approaches, while one man stayed in the chapel with the nuns and children, ready to move them to a back room if the defenses were breached. The plan, such as it was simple. Make enough noise to convince the Chinese that the orphanage was too costly to take quickly, buy time until dawn when American air support might arrive, and pray for a miracle. Father Kapaun understood the odds. He also understood that prayer alone wouldn't stop bullets. The first shot came from the Chinese side, a rifle crack that shattered a window on the ground floor. It was answered immediately by American fire, 3 quick shots that dropped one of the shadows and sent the others scrambling for cover. The Battle of Unsan Orphanage had begun, though no official military record would ever call it that. For the next hour, the engagement settled into a tense pattern. Chinese soldiers would probe from different directions. American defenders would fire short controlled bursts, and both sides would reassess. Father Kapaun fired his rifle 4 times in that first hour. He hit at least one target, he was sure of it, watching a figure stumble and fall. The recoil bruised his shoulder. The sound deafened his ears despite the chaos around him. And the knowledge that he had just taken a human life, that his bullet had ended someone's existence, hit him with a force more powerful than any physical impact. But there was no time for moral reckoning. The Chinese were adapting, bringing up more men, preparing for a coordinated assault. Father Kapaun could see them massing in the darkness, at least 30 or 40 soldiers, far more than his small group could realistically hold off. The corporal next to him was bleeding from a grazing wound to his arm, but kept firing. Downstairs, one of the soldiers was screaming for a medic, hit in the leg by return fire that had punched through the thin walls. The nuns were singing now, their voices carrying through the building, a hymn in Latin that Father Kapaun recognized from his seminary days. The children joined in, their high voices creating an eerie soundtrack to the violence. It was surreal, beautiful, and absolutely heartbreaking. This was what war actually looked like when stripped of propaganda and glory. Terrified children singing hymns while men killed each other in the darkness outside. Father Kapaun made a decision that would become the most controversial aspect of this entire night. He left his position at the window, descended the stairs, and walked into the chapel where the children huddled. He still carried the rifle. His uniform was covered in dust, and his face was streaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. The children looked at him with wide eyes, seeing their protector transformed into something they didn't recognize. Father Kapaun knelt before them, and in Korean, which he had learned during his months in the country, he told them something that no priest should ever have to say. He told them that he had broken his vows to God to keep them safe, that he had become a sinner so they might live, and that if they survived this night, they should pray not for him, but for his soul, because he was damned and he knew it. Sister Marie stopped him before he could finish. The elderly nun, who had survived Japanese occupation, communist purges, and years of poverty, placed her weathered hand on Father Kapaun's shoulder and spoke words that he would remember for the rest of his life, however short that might be. She told him in French, which they both spoke, that God did not create children so they could be slaughtered by men drunk on ideology and power. She told him that the Christ who overturned tables in the temple, who defended the weak and rebuked the powerful, would not condemn a priest for standing between innocence and evil. She told him that damnation was a choice made in the heart, not in the hands, and that his heart was pure even if his hands were now stained. Her words didn't absolve him. Father Kapaun knew that, but they gave him something he desperately needed: permission to do what was necessary without completely losing himself in the process. He returned to his position upstairs, and when the Chinese assault came in full force 20 minutes later, he fired without hesitation. The main assault began at midnight with a barrage of grenades thrown toward the orphanage. 2 exploded harmlessly in the courtyard, but a third crashed through a first-floor window and detonated inside, killing 1 American soldier instantly and wounding 2 others. The explosion's flash illuminated the night, and in that brief moment of light, Father Kapaun saw exactly how many enemy soldiers were advancing. At least 50, maybe more, moving in coordinated groups with covering fire. The American position was being overrun, and everyone in that building knew it. The corporal from Tennessee, now functioning as the de facto commander, made the call to fall back to the chapel to make a final stand in the most defensible room. The wounded were dragged back, weapons and ammunition were consolidated, and the children were moved to the small room behind the altar where religious vestments were stored. It was cramped, dark, and offered no real protection, but it was the best they had. Father Kapaun was one of the last to fall back, covering the retreat with sustained fire that emptied his rifle's magazine. He reloaded with shaking hands, the mechanical action now almost automatic despite his lack of training. A bullet struck the window frame inches from his head, showering him with splinters. Another punched through the wall behind him. The volume of fire was overwhelming, and he knew that staying at this position meant certain death. But every second he delayed the enemy advance was another second for the children to be secured, another moment of life purchased with risk. When the corporal screamed for him to fall back, Father Kapaun fired 3 more shots, then turned and ran for the stairs. He made it halfway down when a Chinese soldier appeared in the doorway below, rifle raised. Time compressed into a single eternal moment, the soldier's finger tightening on the trigger, Father Kapaun's inability to bring his own weapon to bear, and the certainty that this was how he would die. The shot never came. Instead, the Chinese soldier crumpled, hit from behind by one of the American defenders who had circled back to cover Kapaun's retreat. The priest stumbled past the body, trying not to look at the young face frozen in death, trying not to think about whether this man had children of his own somewhere in China. There was no time for such thoughts. He reached the chapel and took up position at one of the few remaining defensible windows. The situation was desperate. Of the original 12 soldiers, 3 were dead, 4 were wounded, and ammunition was running critically low. Each defender had maybe 2 or 3 magazines left, enough for perhaps 5 minutes of sustained combat. The Chinese knew it too. They were taking their time now, confident in their numerical superiority, preparing for a final, overwhelming push. Father Kapaun looked around the chapel at the faces of the men who had chosen to stay and fight. They were terrified, exhausted and bleeding, but not one of them suggested surrender. They had all heard the stories of what Chinese forces did to prisoners, especially to those who had resisted. More than that, they had all seen the children's faces, and something in those innocent eyes had transformed these ordinary soldiers into something more. In that moment, Father Kapaun realized something profound. He wasn't the only one who had crossed a moral line tonight. Every man in this room had chosen certain death over abandoning the helpless. They were all damned together, if damnation was indeed their fate, and somehow that made it bearable. What happened next defies easy explanation, and the few surviving witnesses would spend decades arguing about the details. At approximately 0100 hours, just as the Chinese forces were positioning for their final assault, the night sky erupted with sound. It wasn't gunfire or artillery. It was the distinctive roar of aircraft engines, specifically the Pratt and Whitney radials of F-82 twin Mustangs, American night fighters that shouldn't have been anywhere near Unsan at that hour. Someone, somewhere in the chaos of the collapsing American lines, had managed to radio for air support, and by some miracle of military coordination, those fighters had found this tiny orphanage in the middle of nowhere. They came in low, their wing-mounted 50 caliber machine guns ripping through the Chinese positions with devastating effect. The enemy soldiers, who moments before had been confident of victory, scattered in panic as tracer rounds turned night into day. The assault broke apart, men running for cover, the coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. Father Kapaun and his soldiers watched in stunned silence as the fighters made 3 strafing runs, each pass buying them precious minutes. But the reprieve was temporary. The pilots couldn't stay forever, their fuel was limited, and once they left, the Chinese would regroup and return with even more force. The corporal from Tennessee, thinking clearly despite his wounds, made the only logical call. They had to evacuate now, during this window of confusion, or they would never leave alive. But here's where the story takes another impossible turn. Moving 27 children, 2 elderly nuns and 5 wounded soldiers through enemy-held territory in the middle of the night was a suicide mission. They had no vehicles, no clear route to friendly lines, and no guarantee that American forces were even still in the area, yet staying meant certain death or capture. Father Kapaun gathered everyone in the chapel and made the situation brutally clear. They were going to attempt the impossible, and some of them probably wouldn't make it. The evacuation began at 01:30 hours, just as the fighters exhausted their ammunition and turned for home. The group moved in single file, with the healthiest soldiers carrying the youngest children and supporting the wounded. Sister Marie and Sister Therese, despite their age, carried 2 toddlers each, their faces set with grim determination. Father Kapaun took point with 2 other soldiers, still carrying the rifle that had transformed him from shepherd to guardian. They moved south, away from the heaviest Chinese concentrations, navigating by starlight through rice paddies and scattered villages. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow could hide enemy soldiers. The children were instructed to remain absolutely silent, and to their credit, even the youngest somehow understood the gravity of the situation and obeyed without question. They had covered maybe 2 miles when they encountered their next crisis, a Chinese roadblock on the only bridge across a swollen river. 4 enemy soldiers were stationed there, smoking cigarettes and talking casually, completely unaware that their targets were approaching through the darkness. The American group froze, crouching in a drainage ditch while the corporal assessed the situation. There was no way around. The river was too deep and fast to ford, especially with children and wounded. They had to cross that bridge, which meant neutralizing those guards, which meant more killing. Father Kapaun felt the weight of the rifle in his hands and realized with horrible clarity that his night of violence wasn't over. The corporal looked at him, asking a silent question. Could the priest do this again? Could he kill in cold blood rather than in the heat of defensive battle? Father Kapaun's response was to chamber around and nod once. He and 2 soldiers crept forward, using the darkness and the guards' carelessness to close the distance to less than 30 yards. On the corporal's signal, they fired simultaneously. 3 guards dropped instantly. The 4th managed to raise his weapon and fire a wild shot before a bullet from Father Kapaun's rifle struck him in the chest. The sound of gunfire shattered the night silence, and everyone knew what it meant. Their position was compromised, and they had minutes at most before enemy forces converged on their location. The group ran for the bridge, children crying now, soldiers carrying multiple kids at once, everyone driven by pure survival instinct. They crossed in a chaotic rush and kept running, pushing deeper into the darkness, racing against the inevitable pursuit. For the next 3 hours, Father Kapaun and his group played a deadly game of cat and mouse with Chinese patrols that were now actively hunting them. The sound of gunfire at the bridge had alerted every enemy unit within miles, and they were converging on the area with systematic precision. The Americans could hear them calling to each other in the darkness, sweeping through the terrain in organized search patterns. Twice they had to hide in abandoned buildings while patrols passed within feet of their position. The children pressed against their mothers' and soldiers' bodies, hands clamped over their own mouths to prevent any sound from escaping. One 5-year-old boy started to cough, the dry hacking sound of someone who had been breathing cold night air for hours, and Sister Therese had to cover his mouth with her hand until the spasm passed. The tension in those moments was unbearable, every second stretching into eternity, every breath a potential betrayal of their location. By 0400 hours, they had covered nearly 6 miles, but the cost was mounting. 2 of the wounded soldiers were fading fast, leaving blood trails that anyone with basic tracking skills could follow. The youngest children were exhausted beyond the point of walking, and even being carried, they were slowing the group's pace to a dangerous crawl. Father Kapaun made another brutal calculation. They needed to find shelter before dawn, because moving in daylight would be impossible. Chinese forces owned the sky during the day, and a group this large would be spotted and destroyed within minutes. He spotted what looked like a small cave system in a hillside about half a mile ahead, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. It was a gamble. Caves could already be occupied or could become death traps if discovered, but staying in the open was guaranteed suicide. The group altered course, stumbling up the hillside with the last reserves of their strength. The caves were empty, a small miracle in a night of impossibilities. They were actually old mining tunnels, dug decades earlier and long abandoned, with multiple chambers that offered both space and concealment. The group collapsed inside, soldiers and children alike simply falling where they stood, too exhausted to even arrange themselves properly. Father Kapaun posted 2 guards at the entrance, men who were running on nothing but adrenaline and willpower, then turned his attention to the wounded. Without proper medical supplies, there was little he could do beyond applying pressure to wounds and offering morphine from the limited supply in a soldier's medical kit. One man, a private from Ohio who had taken shrapnel in the abdomen, was clearly dying. He knew it, everyone knew it, and he asked Father Kapaun for last rites. Here finally was something the priest could do within the bounds of his vocation. He administered the sacrament, his blood-stained hands making the sign of the cross, his voice steady despite the chaos of the past 6 hours. The private died at 0530 hours, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the cave entrance. His death hit the group hard, a reminder that survival was still far from guaranteed. They were trapped in these caves with limited water, no food, and no way to communicate with friendly forces. Chinese patrols would undoubtedly search this area once daylight revealed their tracks. The situation was desperate, and Father Kapaun gathered the remaining able-bodied soldiers for a council of war. The corporal from Tennessee, now functioning on a badly infected arm wound and sheer stubbornness, laid out their options. They could stay hidden and hope Chinese forces moved on. They could try to reach American lines under cover of the next night. Or they could surrender and hope for treatment as prisoners of war. Every option was terrible, and everyone knew that the presence of the children complicated everything. Father Kapaun listened to the debate, then offered a 4th option that nobody had considered. He would surrender himself to Chinese forces as a decoy, claiming to be a lone chaplain separated from his unit, and lead them away from the caves. The soldiers would wait until nightfall, then make their escape with the children while enemy attention was focused elsewhere. It was a suicide mission dressed up as strategy, and every man in that cave knew it. Chaplains were technically protected under the Geneva Conventions, but a chaplain who had been fighting, who had killed Chinese soldiers, would face immediate execution. The corporal refused outright, calling it insane, but Father Kapaun had already made his decision. He had crossed every line that mattered during the night. What was one more sacrifice? The argument in the cave grew heated, voices rising despite the need for silence, until Sister Marie intervened with the same quiet authority she had shown the night before. She told Father Kapaun that martyrdom was a choice God granted, not a decision made in exhaustion and guilt. She reminded him that these children needed him alive, that his sacrifice at the orphanage had already saved them once, and that throwing his life away now would dishonor that act rather than complete it. Her words cut through his resolve, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Part of him wanted to die, wanted the punishment he believed he deserved for breaking his sacred vows. The nun saw through him completely, and she wasn't going to let him seek absolution through suicide. The group would stay hidden through the day, conserve their strength, and attempt the escape together when darkness returned. It was still a long shot, but it was better than certain death disguised as heroism. The day that followed was one of the longest any of them would ever experience. They could hear Chinese patrols moving through the area, sometimes passing close enough to the cave entrance that they could make out individual words. The children remained remarkably silent, traumatized into a state of shock that manifested as eerie stillness. The soldiers took turns on watch, 2-hour shifts that felt like eternities, while the others tried to rest. Father Kapaun spent much of the day sitting with the children, offering what comfort he could without words, his presence alone providing some measure of security. He also spent time in prayer, but his prayers had changed. He was no longer asking for forgiveness or guidance. He was simply talking to God, having the kind of honest conversation that most people never have with their deity, asking why innocent children had to suffer for the political games of nations, why good men had to become killers to protect life, why the world was so fundamentally broken. Around 1400 hours, they heard something that made everyone's blood run cold. Children's voices speaking Korean, getting closer to the cave. At first, they thought Chinese forces were using child soldiers, but then they realized the truth was somehow worse. The voices belonged to children from nearby villages, now being used by enemy soldiers to search caves and buildings, places where adult soldiers might trigger defensive fire. The Chinese were using human shields, knowing that Americans were reluctant to fire on children. It was a brutal tactic, and it put Father Kapaun's group in an impossible position. If the village children discovered them and reported back, they would be killed or captured. But they couldn't harm other children to protect their own. The moral calculus of war had reached a point of complete absurdity. One of the village children, a girl no older than 8, came within feet of the cave entrance, peering into the darkness. She must have seen something, a flash of movement or the glint of metal, because her eyes went wide and she froze. Father Kapaun made a split-second decision. He stepped forward into the dim light where she could see him clearly, placed his finger to his lips in a universal gesture of silence, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his rosary. He held it up so she could see the crucifix, hoping she would recognize it, hoping she understood that whoever was hiding in this cave was on her side. The girl stared at the rosary for what felt like an eternity, then turned and called out to the soldiers in Korean that the cave was empty, just rocks and darkness. She had lied to save them, a child's act of mercy in a world gone mad. The near discovery shook everyone's nerves, making it clear that staying in the caves much longer was untenable. As soon as darkness fell at approximately 1830 hours, the group prepared to move. They had one advantage now. They had spent the day listening to Chinese patrol patterns and had a better sense of where enemy forces were concentrated. The corporal from Tennessee, working from memory and the limited intelligence they had gathered, plotted a route that would take them southeast toward where he believed American lines had stabilized. It was a 15-mile journey through enemy-held territory, to be accomplished in a single night with exhausted soldiers, traumatized children, and wounded men who could barely walk. The odds of success were minuscule, but they were better than the odds of surviving another day in the caves. The escape began at 1900 hours under a moonless sky that provided excellent cover, but made navigation nearly impossible. Father Kapaun and the corporal led the group, using a combination of compass heading and sheer instinct to guide them through the frozen landscape. They moved in complete silence, communicating only through hand signals that the soldiers had hastily taught the older children during the day. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and many of the children lacked proper winter clothing, their thin garments offering almost no protection against the biting wind. Soldiers gave up their own jackets and blankets, wrapping the smallest children until the Americans themselves were shivering violently. This was survival at its most basic: shared warmth, shared risk, shared determination to see the next sunrise. They covered the first 3 miles without incident, crossing open fields and skirting village perimeters, ghosts moving through a landscape of war. The first real crisis came at approximately 2100 hours when they encountered an unexpected obstacle. A Chinese military encampment had been established directly in their path, spread across what should have been empty farmland. Dozens of tents were visible, trucks were parked in neat rows, and soldiers moved between campfires that dotted the area like earthbound stars. There was no way around it without adding hours to their journey, hours they didn't have before dawn exposed them. The corporal and Father Kapaun crawled forward to scout the camp's perimeter, looking for any gap in the security. What they found was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. The camp was relaxed, soldiers were eating and talking casually, guards were present, but not particularly vigilant. The Chinese believed they had complete control of this area and weren't expecting enemy movement. Complacency could be exploited, but it would require nerves of steel and perfect execution. The plan they devised was insane by any military standard. They would split into 3 smaller groups and move through the camp itself, using the darkness between tents and the general chaos of a military encampment to mask their passage. Soldiers would carry children, moving quickly but not running, trying to blend into the shadows and the expected movement of camp personnel. If challenged, they would keep walking and hope that darkness and distance prevented clear identification. If fired upon, they would scatter and try to regroup on the far side. It was a plan born of desperation, and everyone knew that a single mistake would doom them all. Father Kapaun took the first group, which included Sister Marie and 6 children. The corporal took the second with Sister Therese and 8 children. The remaining soldier led the third group with the remaining children and wounded who could still walk. Father Kapaun's group entered the camp at 21:30 hours, walking between 2 rows of tents with hearts pounding so hard they could hear blood rushing in their ears. A Chinese soldier passed within arm's reach, so close they could smell the cigarette smoke on his uniform. But he was focused on reaching the latrine and never looked their direction. They passed a command tent, where officers were studying maps by lantern light, their voices carrying in the cold air, discussing positions and strategies in Mandarin that Father Kapaun couldn't understand. 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet. Every step was a small victory, every second without discovery a minor miracle. Then, when they were nearly through, one of the children stumbled, crying out in pain as he twisted his ankle. The sound wasn't loud, barely more than a gasp, but in the heightened tension of that moment, it seemed to echo across the entire camp. A Chinese soldier turned toward the sound, his rifle coming up, his mouth opening to shout an alarm. Father Kapaun reacted on pure instinct, stepping between the soldier and the children, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, while simultaneously speaking in the only Chinese phrase he knew, something he had learned from a Korean translator weeks earlier. He said he was lost, he was looking for the medical tent, he was just a chaplain. The soldier stared at him in confusion, trying to process why an American chaplain was alone in the middle of a Chinese camp. In that moment of hesitation, one of the other soldiers in Father Kapaun's group moved silently behind the Chinese soldier and struck him with the butt of a rifle, dropping him unconscious to the ground. They dragged him between 2 tents hidden from view, and then ran, abandoning all pretense of stealth, sprinting for the far edge of the camp with children bouncing in their arms. Behind them, shouts erupted as the unconscious soldier was discovered, as the alarm was raised. As the entire camp exploded into activity, chaos erupted across the Chinese encampment as soldiers poured out of tents, grabbing weapons and shouting commands. Searchlights mounted on trucks flickered to life, sweeping beams across the darkness like mechanical eyes hunting for prey. Father Kapaun's group had made it to the tree line on the far side of the camp, but the other 2 groups were still inside the perimeter when the alarm sounded. The corporal's group was caught in the open, halfway between tents, when a searchlight beam locked onto them. For a horrifying moment, they were fully illuminated, soldiers carrying children, their American uniforms clearly visible. Rifle fire erupted immediately, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet as they dove for cover behind a supply truck. The third group, still near the camp's center, made the desperate decision to hide rather than run, pulling children into an empty tent and praying they wouldn't be searched. The carefully coordinated escape had disintegrated into pure chaos, and Father Kapaun could only watch helplessly from the tree line as his people were pinned down. But then something unexpected happened that none of them could have predicted. The little Korean girl from the cave, the one who had lied to protect them earlier that day, was in this camp. She had been brought here with other village children, likely being used for labor or as human shields for future operations. When she saw the American soldiers trapped behind the truck, children in their arms, she did something that defied all logic and self-preservation. She ran into the open, screaming in Korean that there was a fire in one of the ammunition tents on the opposite side of camp. It was a complete lie, but she sold it with such conviction, such panic in her voice, that several soldiers turned to look. In that moment of divided attention, the corporal's group broke from cover and ran, firing their remaining ammunition wildly to create confusion, not aiming to hit anyone, but simply to add to the chaos. They made it to the tree line seconds before concentrated fire would have cut them down. The third group wasn't so fortunate. When soldiers searched the tent where they were hiding, they found 5 American soldiers, Sister Therese, and 13 children huddled in the darkness. They were captured without a shot fired, surrendering rather than risk the children's lives in a firefight they couldn't win. Father Kapaun watched it happen through the trees, saw his people being forced to their knees, hands on their heads, and felt a rage and helplessness that was almost physical in its intensity. He wanted to go back, to surrender himself in exchange for their freedom, but the corporal grabbed his arm and said what everyone already knew. Going back would only add to the body count, it wouldn't save anyone. The best thing they could do for the captured group was to get the remaining children to safety and report what happened to ensure that the sacrifice wasn't in vain. It was cold military logic, and it was absolutely correct, and Father Kapaun hated it with every fiber of his being. The survivors, now reduced to 14 children, 2 soldiers, Father Kapaun and Sister Marie, ran through the night with Chinese patrols in pursuit. They could hear vehicles starting up behind them, hear orders being shouted, hear the baying of dogs that suggested tracking units were being deployed. The forest provided some cover, but it also slowed them down, especially the younger children who stumbled over roots and undergrowth in the darkness. One soldier, the one who had taught Father Kapaun how to use the rifle what felt like a lifetime ago, made a decision that would haunt the survivors forever. He told them to keep running, handed his weapon to the corporal, and then turned back toward the pursuing Chinese forces. He was going to create a diversion, to draw fire and attention, to buy them time. Father Kapaun tried to stop him, but the soldier was already gone, disappearing into the darkness. 30 seconds later, they heard gunfire. A single American weapon against what sounded like dozens of Chinese rifles. A one-man last stand in a forest that would become his grave. The final 6 miles to American lines were a blur of exhaustion, terror, and determination. They ran until the children couldn't run anymore, then carried them until the adults couldn't walk anymore, then crawled the last few hundred yards on hands and knees. At 0500 hours, just as dawn was breaking, they stumbled through American defensive positions, barely conscious, more dead than alive. Soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division found them collapsed in a rice paddy. Father Kapaun still clutching his rifle, Sister Marie still holding 2 toddlers, everyone covered in mud and blood and the residue of a nightmare. They had made it. 14 children had survived, but the cost was almost too high to comprehend. Father Emil Kapaun was evacuated to a field hospital where doctors treated him for exhaustion, minor wounds, and frostbite. Within 48 hours, military intelligence officers arrived to debrief him about what had happened at the Unsan orphanage. The interview didn't go well. When Father Kapaun described picking up a rifle and engaging in combat, the officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. A chaplain bearing arms violated the Geneva Conventions and military protocol. What he had done, while undeniably heroic in saving children's lives, created a legal and moral quagmire that the army didn't want to address publicly. The officers strongly suggested that his official report should emphasize his role as a spiritual leader and organizer of the defense, minimizing or omitting entirely his personal participation in combat. Father Kapaun refused. He insisted that the report contained the full truth. He had killed enemy soldiers multiple times in direct violation of his vows and his military status. He wouldn't let the men who died protecting those children have their sacrifice sanitized for bureaucratic convenience. The army's solution was elegant in its simplicity. They buried the story. The official after-action reports from the Unsan area make no mention of an orphanage defense or a chaplain who fought. Father Kapaun was quietly reassigned, and the incident was classified under the broad umbrella of combat operations that didn't require detailed public accounting. But the story didn't end there, because Father Kapaun's war was far from over. In November of 1950, just weeks after the orphanage incident, he was captured by Chinese forces during the massive retreat from the Unsan reservoir. He spent the next 7 months in a brutal prisoner of war camp, where he became legendary for his acts of compassion and defiance. He stole food and medicine for sick prisoners. He carried wounded men on his back. He stood up to guards who brutalized captives, and he refused to let his fellow prisoners lose hope. On May 23, 1951, Father Emil Kapaun died in that camp from malnutrition and pneumonia, still ministering to others even as his own body failed. The 14 children who survived the Unsan orphanage escape were eventually evacuated to South Korea, then scattered to various orphanages and foster situations as the war ground on. Sister Marie survived the war and spent the next 30 years trying to tell anyone who would listen about what Father Kapaun had done, about the impossible choice he had made and the lives he had saved. The military listened politely and did nothing. It wasn't until 1993, more than 4 decades after his death, that Father Kapaun was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions as a prisoner of war. The citation made no mention of the orphanage, no mention of the rifle, no mention of the moral crisis that defined his final months of freedom. The 5 soldiers who were captured at the Chinese camp, along with Sister Therese and the 13 children, spent 3 years in captivity. 3 of the soldiers died in the camps. Sister Therese survived and corroborated every detail of Sister Marie's account, but by then the official narrative was set in stone. In 2013, Father Emil Kapaun was declared a servant of God by the Catholic Church, the first step toward potential sainthood. The Vatican investigation into his life discovered the classified military reports about the Unsan orphanage, and it created a theological crisis within the canonization process. How do you make a saint out of a man who killed, who violated sacred vows, who chose violence over faith? The debate raged for years within church circles, and it remains unresolved. Some theologians argue that Kapaun's actions disqualify him from sainthood, that the ends cannot justify the means, that a priest who kills is fundamentally compromised. Others argue that his willingness to damn his own soul to save innocent children is the purest expression of Christ's teaching to love others more than yourself, that his sacrifice was spiritual rather than physical, and that makes it all the more profound. The Korean girl who created the diversion at the Chinese camp survived the war. In 2007, now an elderly woman living in Seoul, she gave an interview to a South Korean newspaper about her experiences as a child during the war. She mentioned the American chaplain who showed her a rosary in a cave, who trusted her with a secret, and who she later saw trapped at the camp. She said she had spent 56 years wondering if her small act of defiance had mattered, if those people had survived. The interview made it back to American veterans groups, and eventually someone connected the dots. 3 of the children Father Kapaun saved were still alive and living in the United States. They arranged to meet the Korean woman who had saved them. The reunion was covered by local news, a footnote in the broader Korean War narrative, but for those involved, it was a moment of profound closure. Today, Father Emil Kapaun's story is taught at the U.S. Army Chaplain School, but only the sanitized version, the Medal of Honor citation about his time as a prisoner. The full story of the Unsan orphanage remains classified, buried in archives that won't be fully opened for another 20 years. The military's official position is that revealing the details would compromise the protected status of chaplains in future conflicts, that it would give enemy forces justification to target non-combatant clergy. But the real reason is simpler and more human. The army doesn't know how to reconcile heroism with rule-breaking, how to honor a man who saved lives by becoming something he swore never to be. Father Emil Kapaun remains a paradox, a man who chose damnation over innocence lost, and his choice challenges everything we think we know about faith, war, and the terrible decisions that define us. His story was buried because it asked questions that no institution, military or religious, wanted to answer. But now you know the truth, and that truth refuses to stay buried any longer.